We are the Coalition, loud and proud, outrage porn-free, civilly disobedient media, broadcasting on the worldwide Coalition Media Network at Go Local Live Broadcast Center. CoalitionRadio.us, Facebook.com/The Coalition Radio, and as always on the mighty Twitter at Coalition_Radio. Busy night. I want to get right into this. We've got some very special guests still to appear with us, and joining us live right now is someone that we represents an organization that we've had great success with over the past 4 or 5 months here as we've gone to the Coalition Platform 2.0 live media. Their willingness to Skype in from a variety of places literally around the world to discuss issues, salient issues, critical issues to the body politic has been tremendous. We're grateful for their support, and they're willing to come in and interact and really, elevate the conversation to a level that sometimes is almost difficult to imagine. Of course, I'm talking about the Goldwater Institute. If I can read from their bio, if you will, I think it really sums it up nicely. The Goldwater Institute drives results by working daily in courts, legislatures, and communities to defend and strengthen the freedom guaranteed to Americans in the Constitution of the United States and all 50 states, with the blessing of its namesake. The Goldwater Institute opened in 1988. Today, the Goldwater Institute is a national leader for constitutionally limited government, respected by the left and right for its adherence to principle. No less than the New York Times, that conservative icon, has embraced both the thought and the product of the Goldwater Institute, both in the courtrooms, in the philosophical field of battle, and in the House and legislatures across this country. Joining us is the Executive Vice President of the Institute. It is indeed an honor to have Christina Sandefur here. She is joining us, and of course we're going to talk about, as we mentioned in the run-up, we're going to talk about Right to Try. Folks, if you're online right now, go to righttotry.org. A compelling website that somehow accomplishes the near impossible, as they often do. They take difficult material, difficult both in its technical scope, in the emotion underlying the issue and the sensitivity, and yet make it accessible. Welcome to the Coalition for the first time. Thank you so much for joining us. You had a special announcement just, I believe, yesterday about your success in Pennsylvania. Give us a quick snapshot on that, and then let's talk about the issue.
Yeah, absolutely. Well, thank you for having me. And we have excellent news. Pennsylvania just became the 38th state in the nation to adopt a right to try law. And if you think about it, this is a reform effort that is really in its infancy. It's only been going on for about the past 4 years, although the issue, of course, is evergreen. So in just 4 years, 38 states have stepped up to protect criminally ill patients' right to try to save their own lives, and we're so thrilled to see Pennsylvania doing.
Now, you realize you're broadcasting in one of the other 12, right? Rhode Island, confirming its ongoing spot as being the last to learn on just about everything, is still challenged by this situation. But
you're even behind California, so I'm not sure how that makes you all feel.
So first of all, congratulations on the effort, and we're going to get into a couple of issues surrounding that, including the sort of business model that Goldwater has adopted. And I focus this on a lot because, without going off topic for a second, one of the strengths of your organization is your ability not just to bloviate about an issue or talk about an issue. Your organization is actively engaged in legislation and in litigation. And that's really become a central part of your approach to just every issue, hasn't it?
It really has. Principles are extremely important, and everything we do is based on the principles of individual rights, human dignity, limited government. Of course, principles only go so far if you don't implement them in practice. That's exactly what we do at Goldwater Institute. We work in capitals, courtrooms, communities, and states all across the nation in order to protect people's individual rights.
Right. And so in doing so, you're not just speaking to the subject, you're acting on it on several different levels. We've been fortunate enough a couple of times to have your senior attorney, Mr. Manley, on the show talking about issues ranging from corporate cronyism to free speech rights. So explain to folks who in one sense are blessed, really, and this is how sensitive the subject is. You've been blessed not to ever have to think about something called right to try. That type of cancer or that type of terminal illness has never touched your life directly, And so you've never been challenged by this issue. But what is right to try? What's the core of the issue here?
Yeah, so the core of the issue is really the most fundamental of all issues. It's protecting the right to try to save your own life when your life hangs in the balance. Now, I think most of your listeners would probably just assume that we have that right and it's protected here in the United States of America. But sadly to say, that is not the case. When patients are terminally ill and they seek access to a treatment, there are many, many potential treatment options out there that are stuck in bureaucratic red tape. On average, it takes about 15 years for a life-saving drug to make it through the Federal Food and Drug Administration process. And we know that process under the name clinical trials. This is a scientifically rigorous process, and it's not necessarily a bad thing, but throughout that lengthy period of time, the FDA is testing not only to make sure that a drug is safe, which we can all get behind, but to make sure that a drug is effective for a particular patient. And of course, we're never going to have full information to know whether or not a particular drug is going to work under all circumstances and for all patients. So it's really kind of an arbitrary line that we're drawing. Now imagine that you are a terminally ill patient and you are diagnosed with an illness and your doctor says that you may only have months, weeks, or even days to live. And you have exhausted all the government-approved options out there, and your doctor says there is a promising treatment, and it's going through the FDA process now, and it's about a decade away from being approved. Can you imagine how devastating that would be for you? The Right to Try movement is about addressing those people who are out of all government-approved options, who can't get into a clinical trial to participate, and who just want one last right to try to save their own lives without having beg the federal government for permission to do so.
All right, and let's, one need only go back to the HIV crisis and understand that the cocktail of drugs that emerged as the beginning of a curative process arose fairly suddenly after a massive, really a national effort was mobilized, and I use the term mobilized intentionally, to focus on HIV. There are legions of folks who passed literally in the months and year or so in the run-up to the final, release of that drug. And so imagine as a family member or as a parent where, and tragically cancer strikes so many of our very, very young, you're looking into the eyes of your child knowing that given the exponential rate of increases in technology these days, that a cure may be literally around the corner. But the FDA, interestingly enough, just at trivia, when I was in high school in the 70s in New Jersey, that was where the original, companies like Schering-Plough, Hoffman LaRoche, Merck, the original pharmacy, big pharma belt was actually in New Jersey, of all places. And until a little company called, that became SmithKline came along and challenged the period of time with which drug manufacturers can have monopolies on drugs. It was a very staid process that at that time in history began this evolution until this generation is needed to approve a drug. Yet at the same time, in other countries around the world, there's reasonable processes in place to approve drugs. I mean, we're not talking about crazy solutions here. We're talking about well-vetted, scientifically tested approaches to curing serious illnesses, aren't we? That are bottled up here in the United States.
Yeah, and you mentioned Europe, and that's really what is so shocking to me and to a lot of people who support Right to Try, is that, in our country, we are so free, and it's because of our freedom that we're able to be innovative and that we can come up with these solutions that are technologically innovative and save people's lives. And yet in that very same country that empowers companies and scientists to come up with these treatments, we are prohibited by our government from actually trying those treatments, oftentimes before it's too late. And there's a young man, actually, whose story is really quite remarkable. He was 10 years old. He's from Arizona. His name is Diego Morris. 10 years old when he was diagnosed with osteosarcoma. That's a rare form of bone cancer that can be fatal. And there was a treatment out there that had been vetted, that was safe, that had been being used effectively in countries across the world. And it was prescribed for him by his doctor. The doctor said, this is something that could really save your life. and yet it was not available because it was not approved in the United States. And so Diego had to pick up his life at 10 years old, say goodbye to his family, goodbye to his friends and his support system, and not only travel, but move to Europe for an entire year in order to get that treatment. And Diego's story actually has a happy ending because that treatment was successful. It saved his life, and now he's 17 years old and working to support the Right to Try movement here in the United States. But the sad reality is that most people do not have the means or the connections to be able to pick up their entire lives and move for 12 months to another country in order to get life-saving treatments. And that is at the crux of the Right to Try movement. It's making sure that everybody who needs access to these treatments, not just the wealthy and well-connected, are able to get it.
Right, because one of the conundrums, if you will, of the American medical institution, if you will, is that, and please, I mean, this is why we have experts on the show, because we try to clear up urban legend and misinformation. But it strikes me that a significant problem in treating these aggressive forms of cancer with new technology is not that the medicine doesn't work, but it's being held up because it doesn't work well enough, or that there are potential side effects that have to be studied, as opposed to looking at the reality of individual medical situations and saying, okay, for example, there are aggressive forms of cancer where you're given months, and so you simply run out of time, and Americans are running out of time all the time, because if in fact they're not in a position to move, or in fact that program may be available domestically, the only other alternative right now is in the courts, isn't it? I mean, you have to literally sue. I mean, talk to us about that process. How do you sue your way out of a situation like this? It must be enormously expensive.
It is enormously expensive. In fact, we have never been able to get a case up to the United States Supreme Court in order to defend the right to try to save one's life. That has just been a very, very difficult, expensive process, and oftentimes people die during that process. It can take years, it can even take decades to go through the court process. And similarly, the FDA has a little exception that they like to call compassionate use. And that says that, look, if you can't get into a clinical trial, there is a special exception that sometimes the government will grant to people who are desperate and need to try medications that are still working their way through the process. That process is incredibly cumbersome. It involves mountains of paperwork. Doctors have told us it can take hundreds of hours per patient to complete that paperwork. It's very cumbersome. It's almost like running a mini clinical trial just for one particular patient. And in Diego's case, the young man that I just mentioned, his doctor told him that he had about a week to be able to get that treatment. And if he were to wait longer than a week, it would be ineffective for him. And so he didn't have time to fill out paper or beg the federal government for permission to try to save his own life. They just picked up and went to Europe. And that's exactly the problem here. Dying patients, people who have exhausted all government-approved options and whose doctors know that there's a treatment out there that could help them, they shouldn't have to beg the courts. They shouldn't have to beg the FDA. All they should have to do is work with their doctors and work with the pharmaceutical companies. And if everybody agrees on a treatment option, they should be able to try that treatment even if it doesn't work. There is absolutely a chance that these treatments won't work. They haven't been fully vetted. But dying patients know that they face imminent death. And so if they want to try a medicine that is safe for them to try, even if it's a long shot, they should be able to do that without some bureaucrat standing in their way.
Right, and they shouldn't have to bankrupt themselves either. And what's frustrating as an activist, and this show is pure activism. We don't pretend to be journalists, or we're passionate about our issues. We're very much involved on a local level in the medical cannabis movement, and it's become readily apparent, whether it be a right to try situation or a situation involving medical cannabis or other alternative forms, that rather than embrace the available technology at an earlier stage in the process, it has to be portrayed as a latch-dish effort, which in and of itself becomes a self-fulfilling prophecy. If you wait so long that both the financial resources, the spiritual body, and the corporal body have been destroyed, well, guess what? You're not going to be successful, except in a few Hail Mary cases.
Yeah, and the sad reality is that the FDA will point to the clinical trial system and they'll say, well, look, dying patients can participate in the scientific experiment itself and gain access to the drug. But you mentioned sometimes it's too late. Only about 3% of all terminal patients make it into the clinical trial system because many of them are too sick. Of course, the clinical trial is a science experiment and it's trying to test a drug's efficacy on a particular population. And if you're too sick, it's not going to yield the kind of data that the FDA is looking for. And cruelly ironic, sometimes people are too well to be able to join a clinical trial because their disease hasn't manifested long enough. And again, it's not going to yield the type of results that the FDA is looking for. So most of terminal patients, about 97% of them, are just out of luck because they're either too well or too sick to enter into the clinical trial system. And that's the only option that they have. So right to try is really about equity. It says, look, once the FDA says that a drug is safe enough for testing in human beings, then it ought to be available to any human being that wants to try it, not just those who are lucky enough to meet the standards of a science experiment or who have the means to be able to travel overseas.
Exactly, because I might add too that very often folks in that situation are not manifesting a single illness. It's often complicated by the presence of other medical issues, which again rendered them incompatible with the type of purely academic testing that the FDA obsesses over. How did we? Can you reflect on how we got here? Because ultimately, the oldest cliche in media is if you don't learn from the history. But it's a provocative conversation in and of itself because if you challenge government like we do for a living over here, you constantly see the same thought process manifesting itself in different areas of the body politic with predictable results. And that could be on anything from privacy to medical and freedom to any one of a number of issues. How did we get here? This is crazy.
Well, the FDA, when it was created about 100 years ago, the point of that agency was to empower patients to be able to make well-informed decisions by making sure that they had enough information and that they had accurate information. Mm-hmm. And that's what the FDA was all about. And again, we can reasonably disagree over government's role in that, but I think we can all get behind patients having accurate information to be able to make their own decisions. Fast forward now to 2017, and we have a very different situation. And I think the way we got there is that over the years, and this is true of not just the FDA, but really all federal government agencies throughout the 20th century, we became a country that focused more and more on expert rule and the idea that people really can't be trusted or expected to make decisions for themselves, but instead we ought to have disinterested bureaucrats in Washington, D.C. evaluating all the facts and making the decisions as experts. And that's what the FDA really grew into. The FDA then started to focus on approving drugs for safety. And again, one can kind of get behind that. Okay, we want to make sure that people are not taking medicines that could kill them or end their lives. Although, keep in mind, even acetaminophen, the active ingredient in Tylenol, kills about 400 people per year. So no drug is absolutely safe. But nevertheless, then we move on to the FDA today, which now tests not only for safety, but again for efficacy, to make sure that the medicines are actually going to be effective. And again, you mentioned this before, this is kind of just an arbitrary line. I think, I think the bureaucracy's heart is in the right place. They want to make sure that patients are taking medicines that are actually going to work for them. But we have absolutely no idea whether a medicine is going to for sure work for any particular individual. If you look at the treatments that are available to cancer patients today, chemotherapy is a widely used treatment. Chemotherapy is literally poison. It's very unsafe, and oftentimes it's not effective for cancer patients, and yet the FDA allows patients to take treatment. So why is it that we're drawing some arbitrary line and imposing red tape after red tape on patients who are criminal and, again, don't want access to medications that could help them? That is really the situation that we have today. And I think when people say, look, we need a disinterested bureaucrat to make a decision because a patient may be desperate, may be out of options, and may make a rash decision, I think they're really missing the point. This is not a question of science or research or anything like that. We've got the facts in front of us. We know what the chances are. We know what the risks are. And of course, patients know that there are risks that we don't know about. This is really an issue of who should make the decision of what risks are acceptable to a patient. Should that be the patient himself in consultation with his doctor, or should that be some distant bureaucrat in Washington, D.C. who is unfamiliar with a particular patient and what risks are acceptable to him? And I think that any principled person who values life, liberty, and the pursuit of happiness has to say that decision is rightfully the patient's. The patient owns his own life. The patient has to live with the consequences. And if any right is fundamental and should be protected by our Constitution, it is the right to try to save your own life and make your own medical decisions.
Right, because the next logical, or in this case, illogical step is that the very presence of the standard of FDA trials, particularly with regard to efficacy, not just safety, but efficacy, has essentially become a monetized process where investment capital in the development of these drugs is dictated by its purported success in front of a bureaucracy as opposed to market demand for the cure itself, which ultimately then has a potential, particularly in cases where there are rare diseases and it's difficult enough to create a market for these drugs and to create the investment, to create an investment attitude towards them where they're worth pursuing, that the bureaucracy then is clearly actually forcing the market to stand in the way of the logical extension of certain drugs. And again, here we go. You've got then an individual group of people, a subset of folks who, through bad luck or timing, find themselves to be on the wrong end of the calendar on those. But the point you made about trust is so poignant to a libertarian. If I can for a few seconds go off on a libertarian tangent, the fundamental difference between libertarians and conservatives is that as a libertarian, we actually trust you to make your own decisions. We trust that you'll seek counsel from others. We trust that you'll seek expert advice, in this case, in a medical situation. But ultimately, we trust you to make your own decision about your medical futures, about your personal lifestyles, about the choices you make on religion and politics. We are the political movement of trust. We believe that no one is better qualified to make personal decisions on your behalf, well, than you. And I apologize for that. It's why I became a libertarian, because a disinterested bureaucrat in a city far, far away, and again, as an aside, living here in the Northeast as I do, in the New York to Boston, I'll call it the medical beltway, where we have arguably through action of geography and the marketplace, we are surrounded by arguably the finest medical systems in the world here. Boston, as it was Providence, I don't know how you've spent much time up here, but Providence is a satellite of Boston, if you will, with the medical community. We've got the Ivy League medical schools. We are within 50 miles of the new pharma belt, and we benefit from all of that. There's a tendency in this part of the country to dismiss the rest of the country as sort of medical flyover country, because our easy access to state-of-the-art medicine through accident of geography is not something that's easily available to someone in an altogether wonderful place like Kansas or Iowa or Montana. They have to fly their families. They have to uproot their families to pursue even the most fundamental form of medicine. And as a result, through action of geography and the bureaucracy, we are essentially creating a medical ghetto in this country. I hope that's not hate speech, but we are.
Yeah, well, and I think what you said about trust is absolutely fundamental here, because if we don't trust individuals to make their own medical decisions, why would we trust a bureaucrat in Washington, D.C.? They're all people, and I mentioned disinterested bureaucrats, you said disinterested bureaucrat. The truth is there's no such thing as a disinterested anybody, right? Everybody has their own interests, and of course bureaucrats themselves have their own considerations that they take into place. The FDA is an extremely risk-averse agency,
right.
And here's why. It's because when the FDA approves a drug, as it sometimes does, that then goes on to market and causes some sort of problem. Either it doesn't work, or it causes side effects that were unanticipated, or God forbid, it kills somebody. Everybody turns to the FDA and says, why did you approve this drug? Even if, it's had wonderful effects, right? The FDA feels the pressure from that approval. What is unseen, though, is how many countless lives have been lost because of the bureaucracy, because the FDA has taken too long to approve a medicine or has denied approval altogether. That is unseen. We don't know how many countless lives have been lost because of that delay. And so the FDA has its own interest in the bureaucratic process, and they're not going to be putting the patient first. They're going to be putting the process first. And that's just how the system works. It's not because they're evil people or they're ill-intentioned. It's just because that's how the system works. So if we're going to trust anybody, we should trust the person whose life is at stake, and the person who has, a stake in the outcome. And that's why, the FDA may play a role, but if we're going to allow the FDA to play a role, it should play a role in information gathering and provision, and we should leave those life and death decisions to the patient and their doctors.
Talk about the process, if you will, because this is illustrative of the Goldwater technique. Now, in your literature and the conversations I've been fortunate to have on the air, and again, at the Coalition, we're grateful for the level of access we've had to your professional staff. I don't have to tell you, they do a hell of a job. But again, the strength is not just the professionalism, the research, the hard work. It's their ability to make material like this accessible to regular folks like ourselves that is so unique. So you develop in your organization, this is on a variety of issues, what you call model legislation. So how does that process physically take place at Goldwater? How do you come up with a model law that you then essentially bring on the road, if you will, to states across the country with all their different issues and all their politics? How does it start and how does it work?
Well, let's use right to try as an illustration. So about a little over 4 years ago, we were sitting down, we were talking with some doctors and hospitals about the medical approval process. And what we were hearing over these conversations was that, the FDA is really outdated. They knew that we were interested in scaling back bureaucracy and protecting individual rights. And they said the way that the FDA does business is outdated because the more and more innovative medicines get, some of them are tailored toward particular individuals, and it doesn't even make sense to look at the clinical trial process and look at a broad population when you're talking about a medicine that's made for one particular individual. So we need to do something to fix that bureaucracy and that bureaucratic mindset. And the more we went along with those conversations, we realized that the people who were, most at risk and who had the most to lose but the littlest time were terminally ill patients who were sort of caught in this bureaucratic labyrinth. So we have a team of lawyers and policy analysts that sat down and reviewed all of the litigation on the area, reviewed, of course, the Constitution. At Goldwater Institute, we believe that the right to medical autonomy or to make one's own medical decisions is a fundamental right. In fact, it's the most fundamental right. So we drafted with our lawyers and our policymakers and, of course, other stakeholders, patients, doctors, the medical community, a law based on that principle and that belief and based on protecting that fundamental right. And so we did that research and we put it out there. And the very first state that became interested in that law was actually Colorado. And that is significant because Colorado is a very purple state. And the lawmakers that introduced the right to try legislation in Colorado were bipartisan. There was a Republican sponsor and a Democrat sponsor. And that was very important to an organization like the Goldwater Institute because we're nonpartisan. And we don't believe that the right to try to save your own life is a partisan political issue. We believe it's about principles and people. So we provided technical assistance to those lawmakers. We created a patient coalition. There have been patient groups ever since the height of the AIDS crisis, as you mentioned before, trying desperately to try to scale back this FDA bureaucracy in Washington and having little success. And so since we work on the state level, we brought all those patient groups together and we sent them to the state lawmakers so that they could testify, so that they could tell their stories. And before we knew it, Colorado was the first right to try state, but it wasn't the last. Lawmakers across the country were picking up the model legislation. They were hearing their patients, they were hearing their constituents, their doctors come down to the Capitol. And we had states as liberal as California and as conservative as Oklahoma adopt the right to try law. And they did so near unanimously in almost every state that it passed. And so at Goldwater, we really see ourselves as the policy and legal minds behind creating those laws, and then the grassroots effort in pushing those laws throughout the country. And then we also have a legal team that will help defend those laws if and when that needs to happen. And so it really just became one of our most successful issues, because it really just took the country by storm, and in just a few short years, became law in 38 states. And in fact, now Congress is actually taking up the law. Amazingly enough, the United States Senate voted in August unanimously to adopt the right to try as the law of the land. And I'll tell you, most of your listeners probably will understand just how significant that is at a time when the United States Senate can't seem to be doing anything, even by their majority in healthcare, unanimously in order to adopt the right to try, even though for decades and decades, Congress has not acted in this area at all. And I think it's significant that this was a grassroots movement that started at the state level. And that's really where the Goldwater Institute focuses its energy, is on the states. And now the states have acted, and now Washington, D.C. is finally listening. And that's really our model, is to just start at the state capitals, start in the state legislatures, to have good policies and principles that back us up, to have human interest stories about people, and then get the ball rolling.
Right. So you're, in a sense, you're a one-stop shop, if you will, for individual rights across the country. You're able to assess the situation, look at the overriding legal structure, delve into the technical issues surrounding the subject, however arcane or challenging they may be, and particularly in this case, and then actually affect and put into place both the structure necessary to support the legislation, support the political side of it, and then actually develop a grassroots effort to get it moved through, which is astonishing in this type of climate, where again, I don't know at this point, there are Democrats and Republicans that if you brought outside today, right now, if they could agree on the weather, regardless, never mind issues like this, which really span jurisdiction, they span discipline, they span ethnic and religious issues. But I'm also curious, in Rhode Island, bringing up the rear as usual, and I reached out today for the record to two representatives, one Democrat and Republican, who have worked very hard to get this law passed. And they weren't able to make the show tonight, but they're very, very interested in watching this conversation and reflecting on it. What's held it up in states? What are the barriers that folks have run into in trying to get this legislation passed?
Yeah. We hear a couple of things. One of the major criticisms at the state level, and at the federal level, for that matter, comes from a crowd that considers itself to be bioethicists. And they claim that right to try laws are actually false hope for patients. Now, one needs to stop and think about that for a second. What they're arguing is that patients who are dying and who are desperate and who have exhausted all of their government-approved options, if they are allowed to try a medicine that might be safe for humans but is unproven, they will get their hopes up because they're desperate. And if that medicine doesn't work, that will be devastating to them, and that we shouldn't allow people to be put into that situation. Now, it amazes me that this argument actually has traction in some places, because first of all, the FDA itself admits that no one has perfect information. The reason that these dying patients are in this situation in the first place is because all of the government-approved options have, in a way, proven to be false hope, have not worked for them. And again, this is really treating patients as if they are children and incapable of understanding their own decisions. I talk to patients across the country, and I ask them about this false hope narrative, and they tell me all the time, there is no such thing as false hope. There's only hope. we know that these treatments are a long shot. That's because, I mean, that's why we're here, because we've tried everything else. But we don't want to go down without a fight. And we don't want to die knowing that our dignity wasn't preserved, being able to decide for ourselves whether or not we want to try this last-ditch effort. And nevertheless, we hear this argument brought up time and time again against right to try. Another thing that we hear sometimes is that, you know, this decision ought to be left to the FDA, and if the FDA feels that, you know, a particular drug shouldn't be given to a particular patient, then that's really for the experts in Washington to say, and that's for the people in the state. And this comes back to the same that you and I have been talking about throughout this segment, that when it comes down to it, whom does you trust to make these decisions for themselves? Is it the Democrats in DC, or is it the patient? You know, and again, I think it's the patient. Yeah, right to try is not a silver bullet. It's not going to be for everybody. These treatments aren't going to work for everybody. But it's just a step in the right direction to give patients just one more avenue to break down those regulatory barriers and let them try to save their own lives.
Right. You know, again, if you treat folks like children, first of all, there's so many things wrong with the argument. Just on a pure clinical level, I would imagine that the knowledge that's advanced by dealing with folks who are suffering from illness with a prospective cure would be incalculable. Number two, I'm not aware, I don't think I've ever met a doctor who has sugarcoated or promoted false hope in any situation at all. We're blessed, despite all our challenges ongoing with healthcare, to have arguably one of the finest medical educational systems in the world, and generationally we have begun to deal with the psychological issues surrounding wellness, surrounding illness, and how they impact the patient. We are addressing that head on, as we're addressing also simultaneously mental health issues. So the notion that people would, you know, treat a patient, what's the political term we've been using all night tonight, snowflake, is ridiculous, because I've had the fortune of meeting a lot of folks in the medical cannabis movement who are undergoing great misfortune. And I'm sure you can attest to this. If the people that I've met that are seriously, often terminally ill, are some of the most bravest, determined warriors that I've met in my life. There's something that happens that transforms these people, even at their most difficult moment, to a level of nobility, and that is hard to really define, hard to really describe. So to cheat them, as you would say, of that final dignity of being able to, you know, to force them to go gently into that good night is just disgusting. Sorry, I get emotional about this stuff. It's repulsive to me.
Yeah, you know what's without something like right to try, what you're left with is the clinical trial process as the only option for patients. And to me, if anything is false hope, it's that. Because
Right.
even if you're lucky enough to be one of the 3% of terminally ill patients that make it into a clinical trial, you may be that unlucky person who gets a placebo, who's part of the test group,
Right.
that's not actually receiving the treatment. So,
Yeah.
you know, and again, that's not a knock on the scientific process or clinical trials. All that I'm saying is that if you're going to be telling a patient that giving them an option and giving them all of the risks and, you know, having them sign an informed consent form and all that, I mean, if that's false hope, then what is the clinical trial process?
Wow. Wow. Well, first of all, if you, Ms. Sandefur, thank you very, very much for coming on. If we could, in just a final couple of minutes that we have left, what are some, what also continues to astonish me, and I hope you don't think I'm patronizing when I say this, but the sheer volume of issues that your organization deals with on a recurring, almost daily basis. I'm fortunate enough to be on Jennifer's mailing list, and it's seemingly every other day I get an email and an announcement from you folks on every issue imaginable. What are some other things that you folks are working on right now that you might be able to tell us about? And you know, and most importantly, for folks who are listening, and you know, whether you're listening tonight or this video will live in perpetuity on the Coalition Radio YouTube channel, how can folks support your organization? Well, quite frankly, by donations. So if you can give us a snapshot of those.
Yeah, well, first of all, if you believe in protecting individual liberty, we would love to have your support. You can visit us at goldwaterinstitute.org on the web. We're also on Facebook and on Twitter. And if you're interested in some of the issues I'm talking about tonight, you can certainly follow me on Facebook and Twitter as well. We would appreciate, if you're so inclined, your financial support. In addition, we are a 501c3 nonprofit organization. Your donations are tax deductible, and we operate completely on private donations. We're actually a fairly small staff, and we're not able to defend people in court or take these issues to the legislature without your generous support. We work on a wide variety of issues, as you noted, and sometimes it is dizzying to see all the things that we do. But some of the most important issues for us are private property rights. We've worked a lot to protect people's right to use their own private property as they see fit, so long as they're not harming another. And that manifests in a variety of different ways. We've most recently gotten involved in the home sharing debate. There are a lot of cities that are cracking down on people's right to be able to rent out a spare room or their home to overnight guests on websites like Airbnb or HomeAway. And, we have really engaged in court and in legislatures across the country protecting people's property rights, and instead encouraging cities to enforce nuisance restrictions rather than outlawing people from using their property rights altogether. So we engage there. We also engage on issues involving economic liberty, the right to earn an honest living. Sadly, in this country, the right to be able to pursue one's own chosen profession and to earn a living and to put food on your family's table and to really make something of yourself. That is literally the American dream and why people come to America. But sadly, it is treated as a second-class right in courts and legislatures across the country. And oftentimes, government says that you don't have a right to earn a living, and you don't have a right to pursue your own chosen profession without getting permission from the government. We at the Goldwater Institute say that that's wrong. That is not what our founding fathers intended, and we protect people's rights to start businesses and to work in court and in legislatures across the country. And those are two very important issues that we work on. We also work on taxpayer rights, and we enforce constitutional provisions that exist in state constitutions that don't necessarily exist in the federal constitution, because our founding fathers really had a vision for federalism. They said, we have a federal constitution to protect our rights, but we also have the constitutions of the 50 states. And when the federal government fails to protect our rights, then the states can and should step in and protect our rights as sort of that last line of defense. And we really believe that at the Goldwater Institute, and that's why you'll see us work on things like right to try, or economic liberty, or property rights, or taxpayer rights at the state level, because we really think there's an opportunity, sort of a second bite at the apple, if you will, to come in and protect people when the federal government has turned a blind eye.
Someday I'd love to have you guys on and talk about nullification. There's a whole wide world out there. Well, again, thank you so much for joining us. Your organization's continued presence on these airwaves, and quite frankly, makes us better. We're talking, of course, with Christina Sandefur. She is the Executive Vice President of the Goldwater Institute. In addition to Goldwater Institute, there is right2try.org, simply spelled right2try.org. If you're passionate about this issue, folks, we need to be proactive. So with the best of intentions, get involved in these organizations, as they should, when tragedy touches them. We as a society need to be proactive. Simply because you've been fortunate enough to avoid this type of serious illness, whether it be right to try, whether it be medical cannabis, any one of a number of issues being faced by bioethicists. We need as a body politic to stand up for individual rights, whether you're in the midst of a medical crisis or whether you've been spared. And it's a wonderful organization. It's a wonderful way to support this. There aren't a lot of people out there right now fighting for your individual rights simply because it's the right thing to do. And the Goldwater Institute is, in fact, the embodiment of that. So again, thank you so much for joining us. and I hope we get a chance to meet. And if any of your folks are up here in the Northeast, we'd love to have them in studio at some point. Or at this point, simply let's just go out for a beer. How about that? Fair enough?
You can count me in for that. Thanks so much for having us and having me, and we will absolutely take you up on that beer.